Hello everyone, my name's Phawx. You know how on the Steam Deck website they list battery life between 2 to 8 hours? Taking a long hard look at that battery life, 8 hours of battery life seems kind of bogus. The real actual battery life when playing on device is going to be closer to 110 minutes to 5 hours of battery life. How can I know? Well, I've been doing this for years and looking at many devices. Also, have you ever wondered how long it will take to charge the Steam Deck? The short answer is that using a PD 3.0 capable charger, the quickest time that the Steam Deck could charge is 2 hours, and could take as long as 3.5 hours to charge. How can I know that? Let me explain. This video is going to be broken up into 6 parts. Number 1, there's more than just TDP. Number 2, idle total system power consumption. Number 3, best case battery life for the Steam Deck. Number 4, the worst case battery life for the Steam Deck. Number 5, how long does it take to charge? And number 6, why is a 45-watt charger needed? Alright, on to number 1. There's more than just TDP. You may have heard the term TDP quite often, and you could inadvertently believe that this number is all the power the device will take. However, we are not including a number of components. I went into detail in my previous video. The 15-watt TDP of the Van Gogh APU has a ceiling of power used for the chip alone. That means the CPU, GPU, and on-core power max out at 15 watts. However, it does not include the power needed for the LCD, the RAM, storage, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, speakers, any peripherals that are plugged in via USB, power for the controllers on the deck itself, meaning the touchpads. There's going to be a chip that is the interface between the system and the controller. That needs power as well. And the fan for the heatsink. All of these components need power. Typically, across all platforms, there are 2 tiers of power that I've observed across a bunch of devices. When TDP is extremely low, like around 5 watts, in this instance, the total system power is around 8 to 9 watts total, meaning that the LCD, RAM, storage, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, speakers, USB, power for the controllers, and the fan is taking around 3 to 4 watts in this instance. So the chip is 5 watt TDP, but total system power is around 9 watts. So there is an excess of 4 watts that needs to be accounted for. This is all the other components on the machine. This is the same regardless of running on Windows or Linux. Here I have the Aya Neo running both Windows and Linux, and when the machine is completely idle, regardless of which operating system, total system power for the Neo is around 5 watts average, which on the Neo is a little over 9 hours of battery life. Please note that all of my tests have Wi-Fi on and brightness at max. On the 4800U GPD Win Max, it has 8 CPU cores and 2 fans on the platform, which results in an average of 6 watts of total system power used. On the GPD Win 3, with its Intel platform, smaller LCD, and single fan, average idle power life is 3.5 watts of power. And even on a 14-inch Lenovo laptop with AMD's 4500U and screen at max brightness, I am using nearly 5 watts of total system power when the machine is sitting idle. So with the 4500U, regardless of operating system and even vastly different monitor sizes, the idle system power is 5 watts total. When looking at the core power on the 4500U, we can see we are taking around 1.8 watts of TDP when the machine is doing nothing, when it's sitting idle, which means that around 3.5 watts is needed for, again, LCD, RAM, storage, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, the speakers, peripherals that are connected via USB, power for the controllers on the deck itself, and the fan for the heatsink. We can clearly see that TDP alone is not the only power draw on a computer. This is going to be the same case for the Steam Deck, and Valve lists the operating range of its TDP at a basement of 4 watts and a ceiling of 15 watts. So what games need 4 watts of TDP? Typically, this is going to be 2D-based games. In one instance here, I have Celeste running on the Aya Neo. I didn't tune TDP at all. It's just automatically using 4 watts of TDP. The CPU, GPU, and on-core need exceptionally little power in this instance, and what's nice is that I'm hitting the minimum TDP that Valve themselves list as the minimum TDP Van Gogh will hit. This is great, but you may be saying, say Phawx, the Neo isn't the Steam Deck. How are you going to compare this 4 watts to the Steam Deck? Well, I have a few arguments here. One, the CPU is where all the spend is happening in 2D games. 90% of the time, when playing Celeste, the GPU voltage and frequency is at its parked basement frequency. which means the 4500U with its Zen 2 CPU cores will operate fairly close to the Zen 2 CPU cores found on Van Gogh. Second, Valve themselves list 4 watts as the basement TDP on the Steam Deck. And since my entire argument in this video is that total system power is typically the same across entire devices, why should the Steam Deck be any different? So look here, you can see that total system power is close to 8 watts. I went ahead and captured all of this data and then graphed it. So when we look at this graph, you can see that while the estimated time remaining is erratic, this is because the estimated time is directly calculated against the total system power itself, which is also slightly erratic. But if we were to average the total system power after capturing all the data, the average comes to 8.717 watts of total system power over the course of 5 hours. And the Neo has a 47 watt-hour battery. So if we divide 47 by 8.717, we get 5.4 hours. And if we look at my captured data, we have roughly 30 minutes of estimated remaining time by the end of this capture, which would be 5.5 hours. Alright, let's take a step back for a second. I've blasted you with all this data because we want to try and understand what the maximum amount of battery life on the Steam Deck is. Valve says it's between 2 to 8 hours of battery life. Even if I am generous here and say that 4 watt TDP on the Steam Deck translates to 7.7 watts of total system power at full brightness, which is 1 watt less than the Neo, that would still only give the Steam Deck 5.2 hours of battery life. This is considerably under 8 hours of battery life. Remember, TDP isn't all of the power. If Valve says the Steam Deck uses 4 watts at the lowest, at least 3.5 watts will be needed to run the rest of the components. So what's the deal here? Is Valve saying the minimum TDP at 4 watts isn't actually the minimum? To achieve 8 hours of battery life, that would require total system power to be 5 watts, which, if you'll recall in the beginning of this video, that's the total power when the machine is idle, not actually playing a game. So that 8-hour figure might just be kind of technically correct, but a completely useless number. The actual max battery life when playing games on this device is closer to 5 hours than 8 hours. Well, maybe if you were playing solitaire or something. Maybe that's closer to idle on the APU to get 8 hours of battery life. So idle or solitaire. Alright, now that we have a better idea on what the actual max battery life on the Steam Deck will be, what's the worst case scenario? Again, if we take a look at Valve's own spec sheet, they list 2 hours at the minimum battery life. This is what I like to refer to as worst case scenario, or in other words, a hard and fast rule of battery life. If you have a 2-hour commute into work, the Steam Deck will 100% survive this trip. But here's the deal. For 2 hours of battery life to actually happen, that would require that when the machine is tasked with pushing 15 watt TDP all the time, that the remaining total system power is only 5 watts. Now, in my experience, when gunning a system hard, RAM frequency jumps to its max, fan speeds go up, these have knock-on effects where total system power increases. On average, this is typically 7 to 8 watts. Even being conservative here, if pushing the Steam Deck to 15 TDP non-stop, this would result in total system power discharge being closer to 22 watts. What this means is that it's actually a bit less than 2 hours of battery life. Unless the Steam Deck has a very efficient display, the fan doesn't actually spin up very far, and LPDDR5 is so efficient that even when it boosts voltage to hit higher frequencies, total system power actually is 20 watts, then you'd get 2 hours of battery life, worst case scenario. However, my gut tells me that we are likely to see somewhere around 22 watts of total system power, and what we should actually anticipate is 108 minutes of battery life as the actual worst case scenario. And don't forget that when the system gets down to 15 or 10% battery life, that's when you'll receive a warning. So for some people, they may actually have closer to 100 minutes of battery life as a worst case, like playing Control on the Steam Deck before a warning pops up. So where does that leave us? Well, Valve says battery life is 2 to 8 hours. but my prediction is that battery life when playing video games, even if it's low TDP 2D indie games or high TDP AAA 3D games, expected battery life is closer to 110 minutes to 5 hours of battery life. If LPDDR5 winds up being very efficient at low TDP and the fan completely shuts off at low TDP, I can see this being closer to 6 hours of battery life. But for the life of me, to hit 8 hours of battery life at 4 watt TDP, that would require all other components taking just 1 watt. And the display at full brightness alone will take nearly a watt by itself, not including RAM, fan, storage, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, etc., etc., etc. Batteries aren't voodoo, and they aren't magic. They have a capacity measured in watt hours, and you just take the total spend and divide. It's pretty straightforward. Once you have this understanding, my personal expectations are closer to 110 minutes to 5 hours of battery life. Maybe 6 hours tops if things are super efficient. This part is kind of simple, but I thought I'd include it because all quick charging with PD 3.0 compliant chargers are relatively the same. Alright, I'm going to show you two different graphs here. One is going to be charging at 35 watt, and the other is going to be charging at 20 watt. I don't know which direction Valve is going to choose here, so I'm going to show you both options so you can understand how long it could potentially take between these two options to fully charge the battery. In this particular instance, the 35 watt charging, from 0 to 80%, it takes 1 hour to get to 80% with 35 watt charging. At that point, charge rate rapidly falls off a cliff, and going from 80% to 100% takes an additional hour. So at 35 watt charging capabilities, it takes 2 hours to fully charge that battery. However, if we take a look at 20 watt charging, 85% is really where the cap off is before the charge rate rapidly falls off a cliff. However, because we have significantly less wattage coming in, it takes much longer to actually charge that much. So at 20 watt charging, it's really going to be closer to 2 hours and 40 minutes or closer to almost 3 hours to fully charge. So based on whichever direction Valve really wants to go here, the charge time could be between 2 to 3 hours depending on how fast they allow charging to come in. Which should lead to our next question. If the battery is only consuming around 20 watts, why do we need a 45 watt charger? Well, it's pretty simple here as well. Typically in this situation, 20 to 25 watts will be used to power the system itself, and the remaining 20 watts will be used to charge the battery. From the wall, the AC to DC conversion should require around 54 to 55 watts to deliver 45 watts to the Steam Deck. At which point, I would be remiss in saying that there is also a loss of conversion for voltage stepping in DC to DC as well, but in my view, typically that's not something you really need as a consumer to be aware of. More to the point, DC voltage stepping efficiency is extremely efficient, and it's still not 100%, so this is just kind of an FYI at this point. Anywho, this is the conclusion of the video. I don't really need a Steam Deck in my hands to approximate adjacent system power usage, as when looking across a variety of different devices over the past few years, they've typically had a steady draw. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.